A vast expanse of dark blue water stretches between two landmasses. On the northern horizon, the rugged, mountain-studded coastline of Iran catches the first light of morning. To the south, the sandy, flat shores of Oman's Musandam Peninsula shimmer in the early haze. Between them, barely 21 miles at the narrowest point, lies a strip of ocean that has brought the world to the edge of an energy crisis. For decades, economists, generals, and diplomats spoke about this place in quiet, careful tones. Hormuz, just 7 letters, yet within this narrow passage of seawater between Iran and Oman, more of the world's energy security is concentrated than anywhere else on Earth. And then, suddenly, those quiet warnings turned into global alarm. Satellite images begin to show dozens of tankers frozen in place across the Persian Gulf. One by one, their tracking signals disappear. The busiest energy corridor in the world slows and then stops. To understand why this moment shook the global economy, you have to understand the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow natural waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the Indian Ocean. It stretches about 104 miles in length, but at its tightest point, it narrows to just 21 miles. Within that, actual shipping lanes are even tighter. Just 2 lanes, each about 2 miles wide, separated by a buffer zone. On one side lies Iran. On the other, Oman and parts of the United Arab Emirates. This narrow strip is not just another sea route. It is the main artery through which a massive portion of the world's energy flows. Before the crisis, nearly 20 million barrels of oil passed through this strait every single day. That's roughly 1/5 of all oil traded globally by sea. And it's not just oil. Massive volumes of liquefied natural gas also move through this passage, supplying energy to countries thousands of miles away. There are pipelines, yes, but they are nowhere near enough. Even at maximum capacity, alternative routes can only carry a fraction of what normally flows through this corridor. There is no true backup. The global energy system was built around this narrow gap, and the dependence is not equal. Asia relies on this route more than anyone else. China depends on it for the vast majority of its energy imports. India receives a large portion of its oil through this passage. Japan and South Korea are even more exposed, sourcing most of their energy from the Gulf region. Even countries that produce their own energy are not immune. Global oil prices are interconnected. A disruption here sends shockwaves everywhere. For years, there were warnings. Iran had repeatedly threatened to close the strait during times of tension. Many dismissed these threats, assuming that doing so would hurt Iran as much as anyone else. After all, Iran also depends on this route to export its own oil. But that assumption ignored a critical factor. When tensions rise to a certain level, economic logic can take a backseat to strategic pressure. In early 2026, signals began to emerge. Oil shipments surged as countries rushed to move supplies. Insurance costs for tankers quietly increased. Behind the scenes, markets were already reacting. Then came the turning point. Military strikes escalated tensions dramatically. Within days, warnings were issued to ships in the region. Navigation systems went silent. Traffic slowed to a fraction of normal levels. Soon after, the situation became unmistakable. Ships were told not to enter. Threats were made, incidents followed, tankers were hit, fires broke out. Shipping companies began rerouting vessels thousands of miles around Africa, adding weeks to delivery times and dramatically increasing costs. By early March, the global energy market was in turmoil. Oil prices surged rapidly, crossing levels not seen in years. The ripple effects spread across industries and economies. At the same time, the geography of the region made any response extremely difficult. The northern coastline is not flat or open. It is rugged, mountainous, and filled with hidden positions. This terrain allows for mobile systems that are difficult to detect and even harder to neutralize. The coastline stretches for hundreds of miles, offering countless potential launch points. And within the narrow shipping lanes, large vessels have almost no room to maneuver. In such confined waters, they become easy targets. Even the most powerful naval forces face challenges in such an environment. Open ocean operations are one thing. A narrow, heavily defended chokepoint is something entirely different. Another major concern is naval mines. Even a small number can create massive disruption. Clearing them is slow, dangerous work, especially under threat. Past conflicts have shown that even under favorable conditions, mine-clearing operations can take months. And this is not just about traditional naval forces. The strategy involves layers, missiles, fast boats, drones, and unconventional tactics designed not to win a direct battle, but to deny access. The result is a persistent level of risk that cannot be fully eliminated. Even limited threats can keep traffic away. As the days passed, the global impact intensified. Oil markets reacted immediately, but the consequences went far beyond fuel prices. Supply chains began to strain. Industries that depend on energy inputs started to feel the pressure. Emergency measures were taken. Strategic reserves were released in large quantities to stabilize the situation. Governments coordinated responses, trying to buy time. But the scale of the disruption was enormous. Production cuts followed in multiple countries. Facilities slowed or shut down. Costs rose across the board. And then came the secondary effects. Natural gas prices surged. Fertilizer costs increased, threatening agriculture. Manufacturing sectors in energy-dependent countries began scaling back. The modern global economy, optimized for efficiency, suddenly faced a reality it was not built for, a prolonged disruption in one of its most critical. As the crisis unfolded, a new pattern began to emerge. The disruption was not absolute. Instead, access became selective. Some shipments were allowed to pass, while others were blocked. This created a system where certain countries could continue receiving energy while others faced severe shortages. This approach added a new layer of complexity. It was no longer just a blockade, it was controlled access, a system that could influence global politics as much as economics. Countries heavily dependent on energy imports found themselves in difficult positions. Balancing diplomacy, economic needs, and international pressure became increasingly challenging. At the same time, efforts to resolve the situation faced significant obstacles. Legal frameworks exist for such waterways, but enforcing them requires cooperation and power. Diplomatic efforts continued, alongside increasing pressure and warnings. Deadlines were set, extended, and debated. Military activity increased, targeting systems seen as threats to navigation, but each move carried risks. Escalation could widen the conflict. Restraint could prolong the crisis. Inside strategic circles, multiple options were considered. Escorting ships through the strait was one possibility, but it required massive resources and carried constant risk. Targeting key infrastructure was another option, aimed at applying pressure, but such actions could trigger further escalation. There was also the idea of shifting the focus away from the strait itself, controlling access in surrounding waters to change the balance of pressure. Each option came with trade-offs. None offered a simple solution. Meanwhile, the global impact continued to grow. Asian economies, heavily dependent on this route, faced rising costs and uncertainty. Industrial output began to slow in some regions. Energy-importing nations were forced to reconsider strategies that had been built over decades. Diversification efforts suddenly seemed insufficient. Gulf countries, located at the center of the crisis, faced their own challenges. Economic lifelines were disrupted, security concerns increased, infrastructure became vulnerable. Some attempted to reroute exports through alternative means, but these solutions were limited and expensive. Others tried to stay neutral, avoiding deeper involvement while protecting their own interests. The situation also highlighted a deeper issue: how dependent the modern world is on a small number of critical Naqaط. When one of them is disrupted, the effects are immediate and widespread. History offers some perspective. There have been previous crises involving this region. In the past, shipping was protected through large-scale efforts. But the current situation is more complex, with more advanced technology and broader global dependence. Simulations and studies had long suggested that such a disruption was possible. But theory and reality are very different. Now, the world is seeing how difficult it is to restore normal operations once they are disrupted at this scale. As time passes, several possible outcomes remain. A negotiated agreement could gradually restore access. Sustained pressure might change the situation. Internal shifts could alter decisions, or the world could adapt, slowly adjusting to a new reality of uncertainty and partial access. Each path carries costs, economic, political, and human. What remains constant is the geography, a narrow stretch of water between two land masses, unchanging, unmovable. For decades, the global system operated on the assumption that this passage would always remain open. That assumption is now being tested. The consequences are being felt everywhere, in markets, industries, and households across the world. And as governments, institutions, and leaders assess the situation, one question continues to dominate every discussion: when will it open again?